we are joined by Senator Eric Schmitt, the junior senator from Missouri and the former attorney general, which is rather relevant given the stuff coming out of the White House, who is now threatening to reduce ICE deportations if Republicans don't pick up that slack and vote for the Ukraine funding along with the border bill. Senator, good morning.
It's good to be with you.
So tell me your first reaction to this interesting, well, let's not call it blackmail. Let's just say very awkward threat from the White House.
I mean, it's ridiculous. I guess we shouldn't be all that surprised that this White House would do something like this, considering they completely just opened the floodgates, day one, really. And it felt at the time very reflexive, like, everything Trump did was bad and we're going to reverse everything. And we're seeing now the consequences of it. 9 million people here illegally. But I think that one thing that people probably don't talk about enough is this is willful. I mean, this is not like, an accident. This is on purpose. They're an open borders crowd. These are the people populating that White House now are true believers in this stuff. They don't really believe in the sovereignty of the United States. They don't think these borders mean anything. They think they're arbitrary. We're all global citizens and everybody should be able to come in, get processed, be citizens, and get benefits. I mean, that's what they believe. So we really shouldn't be that surprised that we're at where we're at. And you ultimately need an executive and an executive branch that wants to enforce the laws. And that's principally the problem. So this recent threat of not now, deporting anyone or detaining anyone is par for the course, but ought to be still pretty shocking to people.
Now, over the last couple of years, Vice President Kamala Harris, President Biden, as well as Alejandro Mayorkas, and of course, Karine Jean-Pierre, speaking for them in the press conferences, had said that the border was secure. And they said the border was secure up until about 2 months ago. What changed for them? Was it the American people? Did immigrants suddenly start showing up to the border? What changed?
Polling and President Biden knows he's at real risk. I think this is now the number one issue in front of Americans, even ahead of inflation and the economy, which are still big concerns for people, and rightfully so. But this, unadulterated stream of people coming across the border, the signals that are sent. So obviously they're not enforcing the law, but that sends a huge, flashing red light to the people who are moving these folks, which are the cartels. We've been down there. A lot of people have been down there. But what you learn is they have these spheres of influence and pathways that not only do they, traffic drugs into the United States, but also people. And when they know and they're coaching people what to say, seeking asylum, and then you have essentially people released into the interior of the United States and given court dates sometimes in the 2030s. That's why we're at where we're at, And so the cartels are making a lot of money on this. They know what the deal is, and we have a completely open border. I mean, there's no other way to describe it. And, no president in the history of the country has done this. Not even Barack Obama had this kind of malfeasance on his hands. So it's the number one issue. They recognize it. And why you see this kind of ridiculous pivot now where they're like, well, we'd have a secure border if it wasn't for those pesky MAGA Republicans and Donald Trump. I mean, nobody's buying this. It's a total joke.
Well, that isn't stopping them.
Honestly, between Chuck Schumer and Joe Biden, there ought to be a drinking game. That anytime they say extremist or MAGA Republican, you got to drink. In Washington, D.C. would be drunk by 10 in the morning. So,
well, I mean, it is D.C.
It might be anyway, right? Yeah,
it's not terribly unusual. On with Senator Schmitt, the junior senator from Missouri. So this is one of the things I wanted to mention. You talked about Joe Biden being a president that perhaps was more loose-handed on the border than any other president, yet he's going around the country telling people that he can't touch the border unless the Republicans pass a law. I'm confused. Isn't immigration through non-points of entry, just crossing the border, isn't that already illegal? Isn't that why it's called illegal immigration?
Yeah, and forever we've had a system where if you come here illegally, you're detained and deported. Okay, maybe if you're seeking asylum, you would get a court date. But those 9 out of 10 of those claims are bogus, and it can be very orderly and effective when you want to enforce the law. But to your point, yes, Joe Biden has every authority he needs right now under existing law to secure our border. The laws haven't changed since Donald Trump was president and we had a secure border. There's a couple of things he could do right now with the stroke of a pen that have been, upheld by the courts. One is remain in Mexico. Instead of doing this catch and release where you don't ever see these people again. You make Mexico the waiting room for people as they're coming here. That would deter a lot, the cartel activity, and people would know it's not a completely open door. And it makes a lot of sense.
Imagine if those individuals from that Venezuelan gang in New York City had to remain in Mexico instead of beating those cops in New York City and then getting a bus ticket to California.
That's a very real world example. And those people would never even attempt it, right? Or if they did, they'd be in Mexico waiting and they would be denied and they'd never get here. As opposed to this kind of like, now we got to figure out where people are at. And I don't think this administration is committed to deporting people anyway. So there's no real consequence.
Well, they just told, I was getting ready to say, they just told you that if you guys don't, again, fund Ukraine, a bunch of other foreign spending, as well as foreign aid to Hamas, which we still haven't been able to prove actually goes to people in Palestine or in the Gaza Strip that are struggling, who need that aid, then there are a few times as a commentator or as a columnist that I'm at a loss for words. Openly admitting that you will deport less people if Republicans don't fund Ukraine is a wild one for me, regardless of your opinion on foreign policy spending.
Yep. And they're abusing parole, right? It's supposed to be individual adjudications, but these are classifications or from a certain country, what's patently illegal. You're not supposed to allow that to happen, but they're willfully ignoring the law. But look, I think it's time for people to fully appreciate what this is really about for the Democrats. It is about power and control. This is the same party that wants to blow up the filibuster so they can pack the Supreme Court, add states to the union, right? And so they're playing for the 2030 census. Not a lot of people know this, but you don't have to be a citizen to be counted in the census. And that affects redistricting, that affects allocation of seats. This is clearly the game plan, and to create a problem so big that they believe the only solution is mass amnesty. So I think if you look at it from that context, a lot of this stuff actually makes sense. And then fundamentally, philosophically, they don't actually believe that borders mean anything. That it's
go into detail on that for me a little bit. When you say borders don't mean anything, give me a little more here.
That we believe that a nation state, you can't have a country if you don't believe in the sovereignty of your border, right? If you don't actually believe you're there to protect, and some people come here through a legal process, and we don't want to tolerate people coming here illegally. They don't believe in that distinction. They don't believe in that distinction. So what they mean is that anybody from anywhere in the world, as world citizens, should be able to come here. And we should never tell them no. And one of the things in this border bill that blew up, thankfully, because it was essentially an open borders bill that was negotiated and Democrats got pretty much everything that they wanted. One of the things that was in there that not a lot of people were talking about was, instead of these claims being handled through the normal judicial process, they were creating these asylum officers. And nobody wants to be an asylum officer, really, to say no. So now all of a sudden, you can be granted essentially citizenship at the border, not through a court process, but through these asylum officers. This is, look, if you were a left-wing open borders think tank, this is the kind of stuff you come up with in a white paper. The problem the country has right now is these people are now in positions of power. And I think it's time to sort of wake up to what the agenda is really all about. And the American people are with us on this. They understand. They support legal immigration, but they don't support what's happening right now. We don't. It's a national security issue. We know for a fact there are people here who want to do us harm that have gotten here illegally.
That's actually what I want to hit on. You're a senator from Missouri. I'm from Indiana. There are a lot of people who are listening to this that are from what many would consider flyover country that aren't even on the border. And I've spoken with a lot of families who are Hispanic near Indianapolis. I know that in Missouri, you guys have a lot of individuals who immigrated into the United States legally.
Yep.
They're not really huge fans of this border crisis. In fact, I was talking to one individual who said that the people that he's seeing cross the border on social media don't even appear to be Hispanic. They appear to be Chinese nationals and individuals that might be on terror watch lists from Middle Eastern and Central Asian countries. You're on the Armed Services, Commerce, and Joint Economic Committees. What kind of stuff have you seen that are big red flag moments for individuals crossing the border?
The number of single adult males coming That's a sort of sometimes a tell of what's happening, and we've never seen those kinds of numbers right now, right?
You've never seen those kinds of number. I mean, I'm told that it's just pregnant women
Yeah,
and
right.
like toddlers and
And
ancient
AOC is crying
men.
because of the cages. Yeah, all this sort of stuff, the histrionics that go into that. But no, that's what's happening. And you're right. From the Middle East, from China, we're seeing, folks from those places. There's travel agencies that are popping up in Africa to move people here because they're very well aware that anybody can come in right now.
Travel
And
agencies in Africa
yes,
for illegal immigration.
for the purpose of getting people to a country, right, that they can make their way here. And so, look, it's become an industry, and they're taking their cues from the Biden administration. You brought up a very important point, though. Some of the people who are most ardently opposed to this stream of illegal immigration are the people who've actually waited in line and came here legally. And they're tired of this. They don't like to see this. It's really an insult to them for following the law. So look, if you kind of come from this leftist world and you want to destroy important institutions and start all over, one of the things you do is you get people sort of disaffected. And if there's no distinction between what's legal and illegal or right or wrong, you begin that process. And that's another sort of thing that's happening here. So I just think it's a lot worse than people think. It's going to affect so many different things. And you talk about Indiana and Missouri. Every state's a border state, and I don't mean that as some sort of cliche. The truth is, the human trafficking is happening in all of our states. The fentanyl that's killing people in our communities is coming from China via through our porous southern border. It's being enabled by this activity. And then, of course, the real risk we have of something bad happening in the homeland, this is a gateway. And so, again, I think the Democrats have just made a calculation that they view this as a path to success for them electorally, and all the consequences be damned. And that's a very different calculation than I think. And I try to tell people that in this country right now, we're not arguing about little things. We're not arguing about what, marginal tax rates, or things that you can have a reasonable kind of debate about, of what's the best way to do this. Traditional Republican versus Democrat kind of debates. We're talking about big stuff. We're talking about them being a couple votes away in the United States Senate from packing the Supreme Court, right? Because they just want to get their way, or adding Washington, D.C. or Puerto Rico as a state just because they want to get their way, or not even having a border that matters anymore just so they can get their way. So there's a lot on the line for this republic to remain intact, where people actually, there's accountability and you send people there to make decisions, as opposed to this kind of results-oriented approach, which has dominated the thinking from the legal perspective for so many years. The Constitution doesn't mean much. It's a living and breathing document, and whatever I want it to mean is what it can mean that morning, depending on what I had for breakfast. That's kind of how they view it. And now you're seeing that mentality kind of seep into everything else. And we could get into the sort of the cultural Marxism of DEI and the CRT that's happening in our schools again, to try to fundamentally dismantle the things that we have collectively believed in this country. If you destroy all that and you can start all over, that's kind of their goal.
Senator Eric Schmidt, Jr., Senator from Missouri, formerly the Missouri Attorney General. Thank you very much for hopping on with us and breaking some of this down.
Anytime. Take care.